It was a quiet morning in the office, the hum of keyboards and the muffled voices of employees filling the air. Jordan Davis sat in his wheelchair, alone in the glass-walled meeting room, his presence unnoticed by most. Outside, the usual energy of the office pulsed on, but the tension in one corner was undeniable. Mr. Benson, the office manager, was gesturing wildly, his voice rising above the low murmur of the space. His attention was fixed on an assistant standing nervously in front of him. "Who let him in here?" Benson snapped, his face twisting with irritation. "Is this some kind of joke? We can't have someone like that making us look unprofessional." Jordan Davis wasn't just anyone. He was the founder of the very company Benson worked for, the man who had built the organization from the ground up. But for the past year, Jordan had stayed out of the spotlight. A near-fatal car accident had left him paralyzed from the waist down, and the recovery process had been long and grueling. He had handed day-to-day operations to trusted executives while focusing on healing, but he had never truly stepped away. Recently, though, he had started to hear whispers about the culture in the office. Whispers about Benson, about his dismissive attitude toward minorities, his condescending tone with women, and his disdain for anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of professional. Jordan decided it was time to see the truth for himself. He wheeled himself into the pristine lobby of the company he had built from the ground up. The polished marble floors reflected the bright lights above, and employees bustled around him, heads down, focused on their tasks. He felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes darting toward him, then quickly away, as if they were unsure how to react to his presence. It didn't take long for Benson to appear. The tall, imposing man strutted across the floor, his tailored suit sharp, his expression sharper. His eyes landed on Jordan, and his lip curled into a sneer. "Are you lost?" Benson asked, stopping in front of him. His tone was condescending, the kind of voice one used when speaking to a child who had wandered into the wrong room. "This isn't a charity." Jordan met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said calmly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Benson let out a short, humorless laugh and waved a hand dismissively. "Another one wasting time," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for nearby employees to hear. The people around them exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. Some turned back to their computers or conversations, while others pretended they hadn't heard a thing. The silence was deafening. Jordan watched as Benson walked away, his shoulders squared with confidence, his presence commanding attention wherever he went. Jordan's hands tightened slightly on the wheels of his chair, but he kept his composure. He had expected this, anticipated it even, but knowing didn't make it easier. He took a deep breath and decided, for now, to remain an observer. If he revealed his identity too soon, he wouldn't see the truth. The longer Jordan spent in the office, the more he saw Benson's influence in action. It wasn't just the comments or the dismissive tone, it was the entire culture Benson had cultivated. Jordan noticed how employees of minority backgrounds were often overlooked in meetings, their ideas brushed aside or outright ignored. He saw how women hesitated to speak up, their voices shaky when they did, as if bracing for criticism. In one meeting, Benson singled out a young black intern named Lisa. She had made a minor error in a presentation, a simple formatting mistake that didn't affect the content. But Benson pounced on it, his voice dripping with disdain. "You people need to work twice as hard just to meet the standard," he snapped. "If you can't even get the basics right, maybe you're not cut out for this." Lisa's face flushed, but she kept her head down, murmuring an apology. The room was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jordan sat at the back of the room, his hands resting on the arms of his chair. His face was impassive, but inside he felt a storm brewing. He admired Lisa's resilience, her ability to keep going despite the humiliation. But it wasn't right. None of this was right. The conference room was packed. Benson stood at the front, addressing the team with his usual mix of arrogance and condescension. "Frankly," he said, pacing back and forth, "I'm disappointed. The last thing this company needs is more dead weight. We need people who can stand up and take responsibility, not people who expect to be carried." Jordan, seated quietly at the back, observed how Benson's words landed. Some employees nodded reluctantly, while others avoided eye contact altogether. As the meeting continued, Benson's tone grew harsher, his criticisms more pointed. Finally, Jordan raised his hand. Benson stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. "We don't have time for questions from the peanut gallery," he said with a dismissive wave. Jordan didn't lower his hand. "Is this how you motivate your team?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The room fell silent. Benson stared at him for a moment, his expression a mix of disbelief and irritation. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone laced with warning. Jordan didn't back down. "I'm asking if this is how you inspire people to do their best work, by tearing them down?" Murmurs rippled through the room. Benson's face darkened, but before he could respond, the sound of the clock ticking on the wall seemed to punctuate the silence. "Let's move on," Benson said abruptly, turning back to the screen behind him. But the tension in the room lingered long after the meeting ended. Later, during a coffee break, Lisa approached Jordan in the small kitchenette. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For what you've had to deal with today. He's not the easiest person to work with." Jordan turned to her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "You don't have to apologize for someone else's behavior," he said gently. "No one should have to work under conditions like this." Lisa glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "It's just the way things are here," she said quietly. "He's been pushing people out for months, especially people like me, people who don't fit his idea of what the company should look like." Jordan's expression hardened slightly, but his tone remained calm. "And what does he think the company should look like?" Lisa shrugged, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "You know, polished, perfect, the kind of people who make him look good." Jordan nodded, his mind turning over everything he had seen and heard that day. "Thank you for telling me," he said. Lisa hesitated again, then added, "I'm sorry. I don't mean to bother you. I don't know what to do anymore." "You've done more than enough," Jordan replied. "And don't worry, things are going to change." Lisa looked at him curiously, as if trying to read between the lines of his words. But before she could ask what he meant, Benson walked into the room, his eyes narrowing when he saw them talking. "What's going on here?" Benson asked sharply. "Shouldn't you both be working?" Lisa quickly excused herself, muttering an apology as she hurried back to her desk. Benson's gaze shifted to Jordan, his expression full of disdain. "You're still here?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I thought you'd be gone by now." Jordan met his gaze steadily. "I'm just getting started." Late that evening, after the office had mostly cleared out, Jordan found himself in a quiet corner of the building. He stared out the large windows at the city skyline, lost in thought. He thought back to when it all began, to the early days of his company. It had started in his garage, with nothing but a folding table, a second-hand laptop, and a dream. He worked tirelessly, pouring every ounce of energy into creating something meaningful. He had built the company on the values his father had instilled in him: integrity, respect, and inclusivity. His father had been a quiet, steadfast man who had worked his way up in a factory despite the constant racism and discrimination he faced. "Never let their hate define you," his father used to say. "Work hard, treat people with dignity, and show them what true strength looks like." Jordan reached into his bag and pulled out a small photo album he carried everywhere. Flipping through its worn pages, he stopped at a picture of his father standing beside a younger version of himself, both of them smiling proudly. "If I don't stand up now," Jordan thought, "everything I built will mean nothing." The next morning, Jordan was in the break room, sipping a cup of coffee. He had positioned himself near a bulletin board filled with company memos and notices, quietly reading over them. He could feel the unease in the office every time he was around, but he stayed calm, observing. Benson walked in, his footsteps heavy with annoyance. Spotting Jordan, his face twisted in irritation. "You're still here?" Benson snapped, his tone sharp and impatient. "Don't you have better places to be than wasting space here?" Jordan turned to face him, his expression steady. "I'm not wasting space, I'm observing." Benson barked out a short laugh. "Observing what? How real work gets done." Jordan's hands tightened on the arms of his wheelchair, but his voice remained even. "I'm observing how this company operates," he replied firmly. "Yeah? Benson said, leaning in closer, his voice dripping with condescension. Well, let me save you some time. We don't need spectators here. We need people who can contribute, people who belong. Jordan held his gaze, unflinching. And what exactly do you think belonging looks like? Benson waved a hand dismissively. Not this, he said bluntly. Not people sitting around expecting handouts. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. A few employees had wandered in and froze when they overheard the exchange. Jordan didn't respond right away, letting the weight of Benson's words settle in the air. I belong here, Jordan said finally, his voice quiet but firm. More than you realize. Benson huffed and stormed out, muttering to himself. The employees who had been watching quickly dispersed, their faces a mixture of shock and unease. By midweek, the boardroom was buzzing with anticipation. Benson had called for an all-hands leadership meeting, eager to unveil his vision for cutting costs and improving efficiency. He strode into the room with his usual air of self-importance, a stack of papers in hand. Jordan wheeled himself in quietly and took a seat near the end of the table. As always, Benson didn't acknowledge him, assuming he was just another irrelevant figure. Ladies and gentlemen, Benson began, his tone confident and commanding, this company is at a crossroads. We need to tighten operations, streamline our workforce, and focus on presenting the right image to the world. He clicked to a slide on the large screen behind him, outlining proposed layoffs and restructuring plans. Without hesitation, he pointed directly at Jordan. And as part of this rebranding effort, we need to make tough decisions. For instance, I don't think it's appropriate to allow individuals who don't represent the professional image we strive for to remain in this space. Gasps rippled through the room, but Benson didn't seem to notice. He was too wrapped up in his speech. It's nothing personal, he continued, but we need to prioritize what's best for the company. Jordan remained silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate calm, he pushed his wheelchair back from the table and turned to face the room. Before you make that decision, Jordan said, his voice cutting through the silence, let me introduce myself. Benson froze, his face draining of color. The room fell completely silent as all eyes turned to Jordan. Jordan wheeled himself to the head of the table, his movements steady and purposeful. I'm Jordan Davis, he said, his voice steady and measured, the founder and CEO of this company, and I have a few concerns about the culture you've fostered here. The silence in the room was deafening. Benson's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his usual confidence completely shattered. Jordan turned his gaze directly to Benson. You've made it very clear what you think about people like me, but what you failed to understand is that this company was built on the values of respect and inclusivity, values you have completely disregarded. Benson stammered, trying to backtrack. I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, Jordan interrupted. You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You assumed, you dismissed, you tore people down instead of lifting them up. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock and guilt. Some had likely turned a blind eye to Benson's behavior for far too long. Jordan continued, his voice steady but full of conviction. This company was built to be a place where everyone belongs, but under your leadership, it's become toxic. Employees are afraid to speak up. Talent is being wasted because of your biases. That ends today. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. Jordan wheeled himself slightly closer to the table, his calm but commanding presence drawing every eye. When I started this company, Jordan began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, I dreamed of creating something different. I dreamed of building a place where innovation and collaboration thrived, not because people feared losing their jobs, but because they felt empowered to do their best work. He paused, looking around the table, meeting the eyes of each board member. I've been watching, listening, and what I've seen here these past few days is not the company I built. It's not the company I envisioned. Jordan's gaze shifted to Benson, who sat stiffly in his chair, his hands clenching the edge of the table. Under your leadership, Mr. Benson, this workplace has become hostile, toxic. You've judged people based on appearances and biases, not on their abilities. You've torn people down instead of lifting them up. Benson opened his mouth to protest, but Jordan raised a hand to silence him. I'm not finished, he said firmly. A leader's job is to lift others, not tear them down. And today, I'm here to take back what I built. This company will not be a place where discrimination, humiliation, or fear have any room to grow. The room was silent, the weight of Jordan's words sinking in. He leaned forward slightly. I will not allow prejudice to taint what I've worked so hard to build. Not now. Not ever. The board members exchanged glances, nodding subtly to one another. It was clear where they stood. One of the senior board members spoke up. Mr. Davis, I believe I speak for all of us when I say that your values are the foundation of this company. Benson's actions are unacceptable and go against everything we stand for. Another member added, I motion to vote on Mr. Benson's immediate removal. The vote was unanimous. As the results were announced, Benson's face went pale. He sat frozen for a moment, then erupted, his voice shaking with indignation. This is ridiculous. I didn't know who he was. How was I supposed to know? Security arrived to escort Benson out of the building. As he stood, he turned to Jordan, his face a mix of anger and desperation. I didn't know who you were, he muttered again, his voice low and bitter. Jordan met his gaze calmly. You shouldn't need to know someone's title to treat them with respect, he said. Benson's shoulders slumped as the security guards led him out. The employees who had gathered in the hallway watched silently, some with relief, others with quiet satisfaction. In the weeks that followed, the company underwent a transformation. Lisa was promoted to a leadership role, her talent and dedication finally recognized. Diversity and inclusivity became a central focus, with new policies ensuring that every employee felt valued and heard. Jordan made it a point to meet with employees regularly, listening to their ideas and concerns. The atmosphere in the office shifted. Where there had once been fear and tension, there was now collaboration and trust. One evening, long after the office had emptied, Jordan sat in his private office, watching the sunset through the large windows. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted up from the break room below, where employees were celebrating a successful project. This is the company I dreamed of, Jordan said quietly to himself, a place where everyone belongs. He picked up the photo of his father from his desk, smiling softly. I hope I've made you proud, he murmured.